Chapter 7. I want my manna. Rainy days. Here we follow the Israelites as they are led from their experience at the Red Sea into the wilderness toward the Promised Land, their father's home, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but a land they had never known. 30 days have now passed since their salvation from the Egyptians, and the Israelites are tired of their aimless journey. Well, it seems aimless to them, even though God knows precisely where they're headed. But because they don't know their destination, or how long the journey is supposed to take, or what they are to expect their new home to look like, their fear manifests itself in grumbling and complaining.
"If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt," they moaned. "There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into the wilderness to starve us all to death." Exodus 16:3.
Good grief. These folks had just been freed from slavery and oppression. Can they do nothing but complain about their current circumstances? Had they really forgotten what their oppressed lives were like? Perhaps it was the women who were grumbling, the elderly and the infirm, those who stayed home all the time with the kids, living what they considered to be a normal life while their men were off building stuff for the Egyptians. Perhaps it was they who prompted the men of the assembly to speak up on their behalf. It's hard to imagine that all those men, who had been whipped, beaten, and humiliated to get their work done, would have forgotten in just 30 days what that life was like. Of course, that's just fun speculation, and I don't mean to imply anything against women, the elderly, or the infirm. In fact, forget I mentioned it. Anyway, the reality is that they had now burned through the food supplies they had brought with them into the wilderness. The bread was gone, as was much of the livestock. The whole community of 2.4 million Israelites were impoverished, since they were walking and not farming, and if they slaughtered what remained of their livestock, it would cripple their ability to grow their herds and sustain them. So their grumbling wasn't that unreasonable under the circumstances, though it certainly does make them sound like children. Are we there yet? But God hears their concerns. How could he not? And already has a solution in hand. I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you, he says in Exodus 16:4. Quite plainly, God says that he will provide for their needs. Not their wants, but that which is necessary for their survival. We must especially note that the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron, and yet God still answered their prayers. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening, vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp. And the next morning, the area around the camp was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. What is it? They asked each other. They had no idea what it was. The Israelites called the food manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like honey wafers. Exodus 16:11-15 and 31. Manna was basically Hebrew for, what the heck is this stuff? They didn't know what it was, and so in typical fashion, they gave it the most fitting name they could. Now, the way in which God chose to pour out food on his children is actually kind of funny, and really shows God's playfulness and love. I'm sure we could come up with literally hundreds of other ways he could have fed his people over the next 40 years. But in demonstrating his love in this way, he also demonstrates his provision and commitment. The Israelites, however, had no choice but to go along with this provision. And at first it was easy. The manna tasted great, like honey and wafers. And the quail? We love quail, they must have cheered. At least in the beginning. But just as they were thrilled to be freed from captivity at first, they eventually began to forget what God had done behind them, and they were unable to see what God was going to do in front of them. So here they are again, excited to be in the midst of God's blessing and provision, and they joyfully collected the manna and made all kinds of manna dishes to last through the day. They had manna pancakes, manna pudding, manna stew, manna casserole, manna pot stickers, and manna pie. They shared manna recipes with each other, always trying new things. Those were good times. But eventually it began to wear on them. Not that they made clothing out of it or anything, but they just got tired of it. They ate the same thing every day and every evening. None of the food kept the next day, except that which fell on Friday, Exodus 16:5 and 22, when they collected 2 days' worth of manna and quail. Hooray! Because it wasn't going to be there on Saturday. I don't know about you, but most folks these days can't have the same thing twice in 1 week.
The people of Israel ate manna for 40 years until they arrived at the land where they would settle. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Exodus 16:35.
40 years? That's right. It became such a boring diet that they just stopped talking about it. They just relied on God's provision of food for them every day and evening. They didn't have to go out and hunt because instead it just fell at their feet. It's here that I have to take a moment and pause to ask the big question. If God is meeting all of my needs, would I be content with whatever He gives me? Bread from heaven. But through it all, God sent down bread from heaven, sustaining His people in the wilderness all those many years. The reasons it took 40 years, instead of the 40 days had God led them straight to their destination, are beyond the scope of this discussion. However, we find that even though God sustained His people with this divine gift, this bread did spoil, not lasting for more than a day. Furthermore, the people who ate it still ultimately perished there in the annals of history, although to them it just looked like wilderness. Indeed, though it came down from heaven and brought life, this bread was not everlasting. This special gift was only temporary, foreshadowing the bread of life that was to come.
Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. John 6:32, 33, and 35. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. John 6:47 through 51.
Jesus seems to have intentionally tied Himself to the provision of manna in the Old Testament. If manna, which tasted like honey, was just a foretaste, is that a word? Of what would be expected when they reached the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, this explains why the manna ceased to fall the day after the Israelites began eating of the food of their new home.
While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. Joshua 5:10 through 12.
So then, if manna was an Exodus-only food, it was the bread eaten on the journey between Egypt and Canaan. It was the bread that sustained them on their journey between the liberation from their old lives and the completion or fulfillment of their new ones. And so this manna served as a daily provision of what God's people needed to sustain them during their journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land. Once there, they no longer needed that daily or essential bread because they were finally home.
Yet he gave a command to the skies above and opened the doors of the heavens. He rained down manna for the people to eat. He gave them the grain of heaven. Human beings ate the bread of angels. He sent them all the food they could eat. Psalm 78:23 through 25.
First fruits. Before we take the next step on our journey to understanding the Lord's Supper, I wanted to draw your attention to the very day referred to in Joshua 5:10 through 12 above. On the day after Passover, the Israelites began eating from the produce of the land, including unleavened cakes made from the harvested grain. Then it states that the manna stopped falling the day after that. As we'll see later, Passover is celebrated on the 14th, with the next day, the 15th, celebrated as a special Sabbath, the first day of unleavened bread, and the festival continuing for the next 7 days. During this week, of course, there was always a seventh-day Sabbath. And according to Leviticus 23, verses 10 and 11, God commanded that the Israelites offer the first fruits of each year's harvest, beginning with what they would gather when they first entered the Promised Land.
Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. Leviticus 23:10 and 11.
Because the Sabbath referred to here is the regular seventh-day Sabbath, the command here is that this offering of the first fruits always occur on Sunday, the first day of the week, immediately following Passover. In essence, God tells His people that He will be bringing them into an extremely fertile land, and that each year, in the first harvest of spring, they were to offer God a thanksgiving offering, acknowledging their fruitful bounty and all that God provided them. This is first fruits, and this is thanksgiving. giving back to God in sacrifice what He has first given us, before we eat it, before we burn it, and before we trade it for something else. So treasure this in your heart, because there's more to this than meets the eye. And that's not necessarily a Transformers reference, though we may very well see some transformation.